So this is a practice run for the SPSSI presentation. The research is on how students change through community-based learning. And my name is Rachel Shore. I'm a graduate student at George Mason University. And how this came about was through a class that myself and Dr. Catania and Jenna Cowton helped to teach, called Community Engagement for Social Change. And this is an undergraduate course that explores how individual, interpersonal, and systems-level factors impact different social problems. And we use poverty as a case study. And what we have students do is we have course readings, class lecture, and then an experiential component in which students are required to have 20 hours volunteering at a community placement location. And these are various places in the community. We'll go through more examples later, but things like shelters, community centers where they're doing a variety of tasks, tutoring, providing resources to individuals in the community that might need these services. So what we're interested in is figuring out how to facilitate change in students. So a lot of times students are coming in having very little experience or having a lot of experience with people living in poverty, the population that we're working with. A lot of times people haven't really thought about their own beliefs or how those beliefs might impact them or impact their interactions with others. So here's a quote from a student early on in one of the semesters where they said, "I strongly believe that nobody deserves to be blamed because they are poor. They should be blamed when they decide to stay poor and never act to better their current conditions." So a lot of times people are coming in, they have very, very strong opinions. They have very negative opinions about different kinds of populations that we're going to be discussing, primarily people living in poverty, although there's a lot of intersectionality with people with mental health problems, people with different types of disabilities. And so the point of us coming up with this research was really figuring out, as educators, what we can do to take somebody who is coming into a class like this with this type of an attitude and helping them consider different types of systems-level factors that could be playing a big role on why poverty exists and what people in poverty have to deal with. So somehow shaking up their thinking a little bit and helping them maybe reach different conclusions. And then I included this cartoon. A lot of times as facilitators or educators, I feel like if you just work harder, you're able to connect more or facilitate change in students. And so this idea that, oh, well, you know, penguins could fly if only they worked harder is not necessarily the case. But we did think that even though it's not going to be possible to have everybody change their opinion and maybe have more of a social justice-oriented perspective, that if we had a better idea of what was helping or what was leading people to have certain attitudes, then we would have a better idea of how to change those attitudes and potentially change behavior. So one of the things that we wanted to look at, we basically had two different types of literature that we were looking at. The first was the social justice literature, in which there was a bunch of different frameworks about how people became advocates. So the model that we're looking at right here is by Dunlap and colleagues from 2007. This model is particularly looking at white students' experience of privilege and socioeconomic disparities, and it's looking at the socioeconomic and white privilege awareness process. But we're using this as a general framework to apply it to these service learning classes, where there's some type of a trigger event, an eye-opening experience that leads to disequilibrium, where people's thinking starts to change, and then this is somehow resolved. The model that Dunlap is talking about is using accommodation or assimilation, in which individuals either integrate new information that they were exposed to during the trigger event into their existing framework, or it somehow changes how they're thinking about things. When we're looking at it in the context of our class, we're looking at the trigger event as being some type of eye-opening experience that took place during the service learning experience. Disequilibrium being this process of transformation that happens naturally, but that as educators we're also trying to facilitate. And then we're hoping for more social justice attitudes and behavior, although that's not something that's particularly studied in this cross-sectional research that we're going to be talking about today. So that was some of the social justice research. We also looked at the service learning research to see what has already been found. So one of the really big things is that service learning there's 3 domains that service learning has really focused on. The first one is the learning environments, so the classroom that is facilitating these transformational experiences. So what's going on in the classrooms for these service learning classes. Then a lot of research has focused on individual characteristics of people that do or do not end up exhibiting or reporting social justice attitudes. And the third are the actual experiences that lead to transformation. So what we're really interested in for this portion of our research is looking at the experiences themselves, so what's going on that people identify as being eye-opening, and then what's the process of transformation that leads them to feel like this has been eye-opening. So when we were thinking about our research questions, part of what we wanted to make sure that we considered was really where educators have the most impact. So our goal is to encourage people or promote these social justice attitudes and behaviors. We really wanted to make sure that we were going to be focusing on things that educators had some control over. So really we were looking at the trigger events, since we had control over where students were going to get placed based on which community organizations we were going to be partnering with. And then we have some also control or ability to impact the disequilibrium through the experiences, discuss how students are processing those experiences. So how things are discussed in class, what course material we're requiring students to read, and the assignments that students are required to do through the course of the program. So the actual research questions were, what were the types of experiences that students found eye-opening, and then how were they affected by these experiences? So the methods, the service learning courses were at a large Mid-Atlantic University. We ended up looking at a sample of the students, and so we were looking at 45 undergraduate students over the course of 2 semesters. Most of the students are female, aged 18 to 24, and the classes tend to be very racially and ethnically diverse. So again, the class was looking at exploring a variety of social issues with poverty as a case study, and students were completing 20 hours of service. We ended up having 5 community partners, and all of the students were required to have direct contact with clients at their placements, and that was one of the things we were looking for in the partnerships, is these positions that varied from tutoring to assisting at homeless shelters, but all required students to have direct contact with clients. Then for one of the assignments, we asked students to describe an interaction with a client that has been eye-opening for you in some way. Then we ended up analyzing these essays using consensual qualitative research, or CQR, and what we found, several different types of domains, 3 of which I'll be talking about today, and that is students talking about the service learning placements, the details of their job responsibilities and where they were located, the experiences that led them to identifying something as being eye-opening, and then talking about how these experiences influence them. So again, this is the Dunlap model that we were using as a framework. And really, before the eye-opening experience, though, we felt it was really important to identify the context. So students identified various eye-opening experiences that we coded, but there's also the context in which these eye-opening experiences took place. And the context is something that we had more control over. So we're talking about the location of the placement, so the location of where these eye-opening experiences are taking place, and the job responsibilities that students have when they have these eye-opening experiences. So we found the three most common placement locations were homeless shelters, community centers, which is where most of the tutoring took place, and then students that had contact with clients outside of the placement facility. So these were things like the community garden or a library, or some students had responsibilities that took them to clients' homes. Students also had a variety of job responsibilities. The 6 most common ones were administrative responsibilities. This was, it included things like answering phones, giving resources like blankets to clients, and what we termed as gatekeeper responsibilities, so buzzing people in and out of buildings, and opening doors and things like that. Students also oftentimes were working with children, were working with adults, or were working with families. Another job responsibility was when students were serving meals to clients, and then lastly, some students were reporting having indirect contact with clients, like reading case files, things like that. Students were able to endorse more than one location and more than one job responsibility, but these were the placement locations and job responsibilities that was the context in which these trigger events or these eye-opening experiences took place. So then we're looking at what are some common triggering events. So one of the common ones was students learning about a client's difficult current or past life history. And this quote on the right is an example of this happening. So a middle school girl was telling me how her 19-year-old sister died giving birth to her baby, and how her 3 brothers died on war. Her parents and her 3 younger siblings came to the United States 7 years ago. Her parents left 3 kids back to Somalia because they couldn't afford to take the other kids with them. So this was an example of of one of the students describing what was eye-opening, and this would have been coded as learning about a client's difficult past life history. Another common type of triggering event were what the students were doing. So not just what they were learning about, but what they were actually doing. So a lot of times students were reporting they felt like their eye-opening experience was making a personal connection with a client, was another common one. And there was also noting positive or negative interactions with the client, or noting a negative interaction between the client and their placement location. So the disequilibrium, some of the more common reactions that students were having was when they were focusing on what this meant for them, comparing themselves to the clients, how they had similarities or differences, learning more information about the client, when they were reporting emotions. And then there was what we consider to be other focused. So making judgments about others or assumptions about others, considering external factors about poverty, understanding and recognizing the impact of poverty on others. So the most common reactions, or the most common triggering events, were learning about current or past life history and making a personal connection with a client. Some of the current or difficult life histories might be realizing that a client had a mental or physical health issue, that a client had recently gotten divorced, that they couldn't find transportation for a job. Making personal connections were things like clients were asking the student about college applications, or the student comforted a child's client who was crying. And then these reactions, this process of disequilibrium, the most commons were students reflecting on what the interaction meant for themselves, being emotionally affected, and making judgments or assumptions about clients. What we found with the emotions is that more negative emotions were reported than positive emotions. Things like some of the negative emotions were feeling inept, feeling angry or let down, feeling sadness. Some of the positive emotions were happy, appreciative, feeling humbled. Okay. So in looking at where people were located, where they were placed, we wanted to find out more about whether that different locations led to certain types of eye-opening experiences. And what we found was that 75% of people that were working in shelter were reporting their eye-opening experience as learning about a client's difficult life, their current or past history. When students were working outside of the placement, though, all of the eye-opening experiences were somehow making a personal connection with the client. So what we ended up doing was kind of mapping out mapping out what types of reactions or disequilibrium process of transformation you could expect based on where they were being located. So the first example, we have two examples that we'll provide in here. The first one is looking at the shelter. So in the shelter, 92% of those that were working in shelter were reporting having administrative responsibilities. So again, this was gatekeeper responsibilities, specific admin tasks like filing, answering phones, and then also providing resources to clients. Of those that were working at a shelter and had admin responsibilities, 75% learned about a client's life history as their eye-opening experience. And of those, 76% were making judgments or assumptions about clients when they were learning about a client's life history. And these could be positive or negative, but their reaction was making judgments or assumptions. So here's a quote that provides an example of that. I realized that the client wasn't a delinquent or a troubled kid in the sense that he would never amount to anything. So as a result of working in the shelter and learning about a client's life history, they reevaluated a previous assumption and was now making a new judgment about this client that he wasn't a delinquent, he wasn't a troubled kid in the sense that he would never amount to anything. Okay. And then we have a second example when students were placed at a different location and had different types of job responsibilities, what their kind of trajectory was. So students that were working outside of the placement facility, 80% of those individuals were working with children. 100% of those individuals reported their eye-opening experience as making a personal connection with clients. And what we found in the transformational process, in this kind of when their thinking was being shaken up during this disequilibrium period, 80% were making judgments about clients, 60% were reflecting on how their relationship with the client was impacting them, and also 60% were somehow changing their behavior to meet the client's needs. So the quote that I have for this, I wanted to pick a different reaction. So this is how it somehow impacted them. And the quote reads, "To me, this was an eye-opening moment as I got to make a connection with someone I never thought I would have. I had not realized how I had stereotyped and stigmatized the homeless by never thinking I could indeed have a stimulating conversation with them or relate to them. I failed to see them as regular people who have gone through tremendous difficulties in their lives." And I'll give you a second to read that also. So these were two examples of how placing students at different locations could lead to potentially different thought processes, different kind of the disequilibrium reaction could lead to different reactions, which has potential, has lots of implications on how to facilitate this transformational process within the classroom, or how to talk about things or process things in the parts that educators have some control over. We also found a couple of additional results. We wanted to look at the students' overall interpretations of the interaction. So whether they were viewing their eye-opening experience as negative, positive, both, or neither. We also wanted to look at whether these eye-opening experiences were things that took place in a single interaction or multiple interactions, and whether or not the person with whom the student was sharing this eye-opening experience, so the student or the client most oftentimes, whether this was someone they had regular contact with or did not have recurring contact. And what we found was that 57% of the eye-opening experiences that were reported were negative, 74% were single interactions, and 72% were with individuals that the students did not have recurring contact. So what we realized as a result of doing this research is that students need enough exposure to clients to learn about their lives or to make a personal connection in order for something to be eye-opening, that negative interactions may be just as eye-opening, if not more so, than positive ones, and that even students that have limited contact with clients are still able to have these eye-opening experiences. We also found that students were oftentimes having cognitive reactions were the most common, as opposed to emotional or behavioral reactions, and that something about their thinking was being disrupted, but their conclusions varied. So we knew that these eye-opening experiences were causing them to reevaluate things, but the conclusion, kind of where they landed, varied really greatly. So this has a lot of impact for educators in thinking about how they want to talk about what's going on for students. So if educators have a better idea of some of the judgments or assumptions, for example, that students are making when they're working in shelters, then they might be able to help facilitate the learning process and having students start to understand some of these social justice-oriented attitudes a little bit better. We also found that several students were considering external causes of poverty, looking at systems level factors, which was aligned with the course aims. And so knowing a little bit more about what kind of placements or what kind of job responsibilities might lead to eye-opening experiences in which students are thinking about those types of system level factors a little bit more would be really helpful for educators, and would also maybe allow students to be more directed to consider those types of opportunities that would help them understand the types of systems level factors that we're talking about in class. A lot of the students were engaging in personal reflection, which was an aim of the service learning class. Oftentimes was associated with making a personal connection, but making the personal connections was also, we found that students were less often also considering the external causes of poverty. So understanding where students are coming from based on their job responsibilities or where they're placed and the type of eye-opening experiences they're more likely to have would help educators kind of focus on different things. So those that were working in shelters and more likely to have a reaction that was focusing on judgments or assumptions, talking more about external causes of poverty might be more beneficial than talking with individuals that were really making personal connections with individuals as a result of working perhaps in outside of the placement facility, and focusing more on how it was impacting them and their own personal reactions. And so this would help educators just have more structured reflection activities that would extend their thinking and kind of help push students a little bit more tailored to their transformational process during disequilibrium. There were a couple limitations in the study. So one of which was we obviously were assigning students with the task of identifying an eye-opening experience, and so it was required that people were reporting on an eye-opening experience. However, it is important to note that some students didn't report something being eye-opening, and so those were not included in this. They weren't included. So those that said they didn't have an eye-opening experience were not included. It's also possible that their reaction was more aligned with how they were thinking about things prior to coming into the class than something that happened during the class. And because this is a cross-sectional study, that's not something that we're able to assess. So for future research, we're interested in looking at what happens for students after they experience disequilibrium. So looking a little bit more at resolution and that process of accommodation and assimilation, how people are making meaning out of their experiences after their thought process has been shook up a little bit. And we're also interested in looking at more quantitative methods. So looking at how students' attitudes and assumptions and behaviors are changing over time. So not just a cross-sectional sample. Okay. And we're done.